Hello. Thanks for joining us on this Sunday afternoon in New York, Sunday evening in Europe, and Monday morning in Australia. My name is Chris Harwood. I'm president of the New York chapter of SVU, the Czechoslovak Society of Arts and Sciences, and I'm very happy to welcome you to our program today. At SVU New York, we do a lot of programming to raise awareness of Czech and Slovak history and culture, and to help connect Czech and Slovak and Czech American and Slovak American communities in and around New York. We encourage you to check out our YouTube channel. You can find a lot of our past programming there, and hopefully in short order, we will get this program up as well. We'd like to thank, as usual, the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs for providing a grant that has helped us do that work. Also, we would like to draw your attention to an opportunity to support Ukraine and the people of Ukraine with a couple of initiatives that we found through Czech NGOs that we have high confidence in, that we know do great work, and that have excellent connections in Ukraine with Ukrainian nonprofits, and we believe that your donations there will only help. So thank you for standing with Ukraine with us. Before I introduce our main program for today, I would like to introduce a member of SVU who was kind of an instigator of today's program, and also of sort of a partner program that we'll be having in April. And so she's going to tell you a little bit more about this program and how it connects with today's program on Cold War Olympics. So please take the floor, Anna Bolesny.
Thank you, Chris. So here we go again. How many lives in this audience have been touched by the Cold War? I can just imagine. The Winter Olympics just concluded, fraught with political turmoil, each power player vying for dominance. Russia is in Ukraine as we speak. Shall we observe a moment of silence, or just go on with business as usual? Addressing the Cold War might be part of a solution, although it's an unlikely one. But I jumped at the opportunity when Zuzana Halsey of SVU discovered Maria Provazníková's story and suggested I create a tribute for someone who, through women's gymnastics and the Sokol organization, spent a lifetime protecting democracy with equal status for women. Early in 2021, Harry Blutstein reached out to me when writing Cold War Olympics, in which my grandmother inhabits the first chapter. I could think of no more fitting a way to introduce her experience than have Harry tell us today about the Cold War era, its effect on the Olympics, focusing first on the 1956 Games in Melbourne, and the story of another Czech gold medalist, Olga Fikotová, whose romance with an American created an international incident. For my grandmother's story, you'll have to join in on April 10th, when Harry, with other scholars, colleagues, friends, and family, gather from 3 continents to share their thoughts in another presentation, A Woman to Remember, Maria Provazníková, 1890 to 1991. I look forward to seeing each of you again at that time. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And so please do join us for that additional program coming up in April. And now I'd like to introduce our featured speaker for today. Harry Blutstein is a fellow at the University of Melbourne, Australia. Since 1972, he's been a freelance journalist, and he's published featured articles and op-eds in a number of major Australian newspapers on a wide variety of topics. And he is, of course, also the author of Games of Discontent about the 1968 Olympic Games. Tonight, Harry is going to introduce the US edition of his book, and we'll discuss the Cold War climate of the Olympic Games in the period after World War II, focusing on 2 Czechoslovak cases that made international news. We're thrilled to have with us today, also, along with Harry, a featured subject of his presentation, Olga Fikotová-Connolly, who was the gold medal winner in the discus for women at the 1956 Olympic Games in Melbourne. And she is going to join Harry in conversation towards the end of his talk. So please join me in welcoming Harry Blutstein.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Chris. What I'd like to do is perhaps just start on how I got into this particular project. And as you can see from, this is not my only book, Cold War Olympics, which I'll mainly talk about today, but I've also written another book on the '68 Olympics called Games of Discontent. My interest is really not the Olympics per se, or sport for that matter. My main interest is the intersection of politics and sport. And there could be no richer period than the Cold War. And my interest to the early years of the Cold War is really when all the rules or the modes of engagement were practiced and developed and refined. And that happened between 1948 and 1956. Now, what happened in those years and the tactics and so on were carried on right throughout the Cold War period with a little bit of modification and enlargement right up till the fall of the Soviet Empire in 1989. Now, how did I get into this particular project? Living in Melbourne, the story began in Melbourne, at least for me, although in the book I started in 1948. But in Melbourne, I came across an interview by the head of the security for the Olympic Games, the Melbourne Olympic Games, a chap called Frank Douglas. And he told extraordinary stories of spies, of KGB hitmen in Melbourne who were pushing off Hungarians off railway bridges, of kidnappings, and so on. Unfortunately, by the time I'd seen this particular interview with Frank Douglas, he died, and there was no documentation on all the sorts of things he said. It was mainly based on what he'd actually seen himself in the job. So that got me thinking, well, there could be a book in this and a very, very interesting story about the Cold War. And so I started to first go to the archives, as one does as a historian, and looked into the Azio Files. Now, for those of you outside Australia, Azio is the equivalent of the CIA or MI5. And so, lo and behold, those files were an absolute treasure trove of information, literally hundreds and hundreds of pages of surveillance reports. And in the document that you can see now, one of those reports is from a Czechoslovak driver who was employed by the Soviet Minister for Sport to drive him around Melbourne. She was a woman, an immigrant, not a communist, in fact, quite the opposite, an anti-communist. And so Azio contacted her and asked her to provide reports on the conversation she had, or the conversations that the Minister for Sport had, Nikolai Romanov is his name, in the car. And this report is of that particular conversation. Romanov, aware that he might be spied on, turned up the radio to try and frustrate her ability to overhear. So, you know, it's all classic Cold War sort of spying tactics, and except that it's real. That's the big difference. It's real. And you can see how many few redactions there are in this document, which was fantastic for me. So there's very little that I didn't find out from this. Now, as well as these reports, and there were hundreds, if not thousands, of reports from agents, Azio agents, who followed not only the Russian officials, many of whom were KGB agents, but also agents from other Eastern European countries. And so all the actions of the Eastern European countries were coordinated while they were in Melbourne, which was also something that I uncovered. Now, part of the exercise was, of course, that we didn't necessarily know what these spies looked like. Through a defector, Vladimir Petrov, we knew their names. When they came through customs, they had their passports, in which case we could confirm what name went with what face, which of course meant that we needed photographs of them. And in this next slide, you can actually see a surveillance photos taken surreptitiously by an ASIO agent. They then scribbled down the names of the people who were there. And that helped other agents later on, once these photographs were circulated, to be able to follow the people and know who they were and where they fitted into the bigger picture. So that's really a little bit about how I got into it. Now let's go back to 1948 and see what was going on politically, which of course is the context for Cold War Olympics. In 1945, the Soviet Union have overrun most of Eastern Europe and half of Germany. And just to show you that not much seems to have changed in the mentality of Russian dictators, it seems that we're watching exactly the same going on at the moment in the Ukraine with Putin. But getting back to Stalin, Stalin would live to 1953. So during this period, he was in his prime, and the countries in Eastern Europe fell one by one. The last to be taken over in a push was Czechoslovakia in February 1948. And the then president, the last democratic president, Beneš, eventually he stayed as a token for a while, hoping that perhaps the communists might maintain some semblance of democracy, which they didn't. And in May, he resigns. And this happened to coincide with the London Olympics. So the London Olympics are in July 1948. In February 1948, the communists have taken over, and a lot of the opposition to the communist takeover came from Sokol. And there were enormous protests and demonstrations, and I'll leave the details on that when we have the next Zoom on Woman to Remember. But the unhappiness with the communist takeover was transferred into what happened in the Olympics in London. Now, at the time, the Minister for Sport in Moscow, a chap called Nikolai Romanov, a rather unfortunate name if you know the history of the Soviet Union, and of course the last Tsar was Nikolai Romanov as well. But this chap was a good communist and had the trust of Stalin, and he wanted to send a Soviet team to the Olympic Games. Stalin was not interested in sport. He was interested in showing the dominance and the emergence of the Soviet Union as a world power. And that meant winning. He asked Romanov to send him a note guaranteeing that if he sent a team to London, they would beat the US in the medal count. Now, Romanov knew that Stalin was not the sort of man who liked to be disappointed by failure, and it could have rather dire consequences and possibly a lengthy stay in a colder part of the Soviet Union, Siberia. So he refused to sign the note to Stalin, but he sent a fact-finding mission to London to see the lie of the land and to prepare for the Soviet Union to enter the Olympic Games in Helsinki in 1952. Nevertheless, back in London, things went well. They were called the Austerity Games. Most of the competitors from Europe have gone through the war and were ill prepared to perform a top athletic performance. The Americans were able to dominate because they arrived better fed and better outfitted and all the rest. But among the many successes of Czechoslovakia was the gymnastics team who won gold against Hungary by 1 point. So it was a remarkable achievement. There was drama in that one of the team members had contracted polio before she left and actually dies on the night of the final. And of course, all the other team members, the other women on the team, were very upset knowing that she was in intensive care at the time. She does die. In fact, not that night, she dies the next morning. So it was a very, very sad occasion. And at the medal ceremony, the dead gymnast was actually given a posthumous medal, which was very good of the IOC. And the Czechoslovak flag was draped in black. But that wasn't the big news in terms of the Cold War. That was certainly a personal tragedy. But I call her the manager of the team, which was Maria Provosnikova. We have a photo of her on the left. She was a gymnast, as you can see. And at the time that photo was taken, I think she was 59. She wasn't competing at an Olympic level, as you can appreciate, but she certainly knew her way around the balance beam. And she had harboured unhappiness with the communist regime and takeover, and had decided that when she got to London, she would defect. And in fact, she is the first defector from Eastern Europe since the beginning of the Cold War. So very, very significant. Sadly, this story had not been told until, at least not in English. There's certainly Czech accounts, but had not really been told in full. And it's an amazing story of courage. She goes on and broadcasts anti-communist messages in Radio Free Europe. She's certainly a great hero in the resistance to the Soviet Union in the Cold War era. Now, in 1952, Romanov does sign a note to Stalin saying, "We will win the Olympics." It was a bit risky, but he did it. And here we have the first gold medalist, Nina Ponomarova. Excuse my pronunciation. This photo will be of interest to Olga Fikotová because, in fact, she competes against her in Melbourne, so on. And there's a whole story about their relationship, which is very, very nice. And again, I won't go into it here, but it's certainly in my book. Nina should be in all the history books in Soviet Union Olympic sport. She isn't. And this comes down to politics as well. The Olympic Games was not just about showing the world that the Soviet Union had arrived as a major sporting nation, but also needed to be a message to Soviet citizens that they were in a good country that produced wonderful athletes. Unfortunately, Nina had a very inconvenient history. She was actually born in the Gulag. Her parents were enemies of the people, and she spent her first 6 years in the Gulag. They were released after the war, and Nina worked in a shop at the time. One day there was a sporting event, a cross-country run. Someone suggested that Nina participate. She said, "Why would I bother?" They said athletes actually get increased rations. And at this point, her nickname was the Sparrow, which you wouldn't guess from this photo, but you can see she did very well on the increased rations that Soviet successful athletes got. She went in it. I think she came second. As a result, worked her way up to be a champion discus thrower by 1952. But the Soviet Union, and Stalin particularly, refused to celebrate her as an individual because of her history. So politics is there all the way through. But the important thing was to win, and to win against the Americans. And so there's a medal count, and they had a point system, 5 points for a gold medal, 3 for a silver, 2 for a bronze, and so on. And so already at this very early stage, this is an American cartoon making fun of the Russians. But it was only the Russians who saw this as a competition. The Americans still had the rather blithe view that sport had nothing to do with politics. And the Helsinki Olympics certainly dissuaded them. When the final points came out, America, on the official count, won by just a few points from the Soviet Union. And considering it was the Soviet Union's first appearance in the Olympic Games, they'd had limited international experience, they had inferior equipment and training. It was a remarkable achievement. Romanov, to save his own neck, turned out to be a very creative accountant and showed by manipulating the numbers that the Soviet Union had won. And as a result, he got to continue managing the team, being Minister for Sport for a few more years. Here's another cartoon of the time showing the direct relation. It's Stalin showing his athletic prowess as the new Olympic champ. So this was the nature of the time. This is the downside of it, was defectors. Now, obviously, Maria Provosnikova was the first defector, but in the Winter Games, there were more, including other Czechs in the ice hockey team. From a propaganda view, winning the gold medal count was a good thing, but defectors indicated criticism of the political system. And needless to say, all the defectors were coming from Eastern Europe towards America and the West. And so this became a real issue. And as a result, by the time we got to Melbourne, the Soviet government and the Stalinist regimes of Eastern Europe made sure that there was a good contingent of agents in Melbourne to stop defectors. When the games opened, they were labelled as the friendly games. Note the date. They started on the 22nd of November. The date was auspicious in that it was just a month after the Hungarian Uprising on the 23rd of October. Now, the Hungarian Uprising was a spontaneous uprising. Some students started to march in support for another uprising in Poland. More and more people joined until the streets were full of people protesting against both the Stalinist regime within Hungary and the Soviet occupation. They took over the radio station, students, and in the radio station were the security forces called, the equivalent of the KGB were called the AVO. I mean, their correct name is the AVH, but they'd just changed their name from the AVO, and everyone in Hungary at the time continued to call them by their old name, the AVO, just as we continually call the KGB, even though it's gone through a number of name changes. The revolution was extraordinarily successful over its first few days. They bombed tanks, threw Molotov cocktails in tanks. And again, we can see the parallels in the streets of Ukraine and Kiev, people filling bottles with fuel to make Molotov cocktails. And not only did students join in, but a lot of other citizens joined in. Now, at the time, the Hungarian Olympic team was billeted in the Red Star Hotel on the outskirts of Budapest. And at night, they would come in, a number of them, and support the freedom fighters. So, for example, one particular athlete, I think he was a canoeist, actually went in, and because he'd worked in a chemical factory, he went into the chemical factory. He knew where all the chemicals that could be used to make Molotov cocktails were, and he stole them and handed over to the freedom fighters. The head of the water polo team, who happened to be friendly with the police chief, was called in by the police chief who explained that he was not free to communicate with the police stations because the freedom fighters worried that they were allied to the government, whereas he wasn't. And he asked the captain of the water polo team, who everyone knew, to go around to all the police stations and give them the message that if freedom fighters came and asked for their guns, to hand them over. And finally, the shooters, the Olympic shooters, would go out at night and get real target practice on Russians. So they were up to their neck in the revolution. So after about 4 days, the freedom fighters are actually winning and the Soviet troops withdraw, which is remarkable. Now, the Olympic athletes are in a position they don't know whether to stay or to go. And the new Prime Minister, reformist Prime Minister, who's supported by the freedom fighters, Imre Nagy, says to the athletes, go. You'll be the first representatives of free Hungary in the world. And so the athletes all meet at the Grand Hotel where there is a bus waiting for them. Unfortunately, the airport has been damaged, and so they're going to catch this bus to Czechoslovakia and hopefully from Czechoslovakia take a plane to Melbourne. The reason that they've got the Olympic flag on is there was the fear that the freedom fighters might mistake them for hostiles, AVO agents, and shoot at them. And a number of the Hungarian athletes had been stopped and almost shot in the streets of Budapest during the height of the fighting. So this was a necessary precaution. So the bus travels to to Czechoslovakia, to Nymburk. There's a school, I gather that it had dormitories with it, and it's surrounded by barbed wire because, of course, the Czechoslovak officials don't want the locals being contaminated by the revolutionary views of the Hungarians. And they were probably quite right to make this precaution. Now, once the Hungarians get to Czechoslovakia, they have a problem because the charter plane, Air France, will not leave because they were to be paid by the Hungarian government. But the Hungarian government, we don't know whether it exists, it doesn't have the money, and so on. And so they want a guarantee of something like $300,000 to fly to Melbourne. So the leaders of the Hungarian delegation go into Prague and go to the various allied embassies asking for direct support. And they go to the American embassy, to British, France. They're refused because no one wants to provoke the Soviet Union. They don't want to intervene directly. And so eventually they go to the Czechoslovak Ministry for Sport. And believe it or not, they provide the money, the guarantee. The reason, the quicker they can get the revolutionary Hungarians out of Czechoslovakia, the better. So it was nothing altruistic. It was a matter of preserving the integrity and make sure no counter-revolutionaries were among the good communists of Czechoslovakia. So in Melbourne, most of the attention is on the Hungarians, but there's problems throughout. For example, the Polish team actually make a request to the Australian organisers not to be set up in the Olympic Village next to the Russians. So the Russians are not popular even among the other Eastern European countries. We also, there's dissension in the Romanian team, mainly because quite a few of the Romanians were ethnically Hungarian. So they certainly sympathised with their colleagues. The only people who seemed to be totally oblivious to what was going on in Hungary was the Soviet team. And this was all going to come to a head when the Soviets met the Hungarians in the semi-final of the water polo match. And it's one of the most violent matches in the history of Olympic water polo. And near the end of the game, fortunately, the Hungarians are up 4-0 at this point. One of the Russians smacks Ervin Zador in the face, and you can see his bleeding face there in the photo. This photo went around the world, and it became symbolic of the, what was happening, of the violence of the Soviet Union in Hungary. It was also the violence in the water polo, and this was a convenient photo to represent that. Just getting back to what was happening in Hungary, the revolution started on the 23rd. On about the 29th of October, it looked like the freedom fighters had won. And then on the 4th of October, the Soviet Union reinvaded, totally crushed the revolution. So the Hungarians now in Melbourne, supposedly representing Free Hungary, were very much, unhappy with the state of affairs in their home country. So now I come to the Cold War romance. Up till now, it's been very much confrontation, the violence in the pool. The game was called the blood in the water match. But in Melbourne, there was a much nicer story between Olga Fikotová and Hal Connolly. Olga was a discus thrower and was successful, winning gold. And if you see, she's holding in her hand the pet bear that her father put in her cot when she was born. And she had met Hal on the training field. They seem to have got on very well. And I'm just wondering if I can ask Olga a question.
Certainly.
Oh, good, Olga. Tell me, what was it about Hal that attracted you to him?
Oh, there was kind of an incidental situation, in a way caused by this incredibly beautiful arrangements that the city of Melbourne and the Australian Olympic Committee made for athletes. Among them, park-like setting for training areas. So where there was my discus area, nearby was a trailer that stored the equipment. After one of my training, I returned the equipment, and there were 2 steps to come up. I chose to jump down of that 2 steps, but instead of grass, I landed on 3 young men, one Alejandro Diaz from Chile, the middle one, Hal Connolly from the United States, and Al Hall from the United States. The first 3 Americans or Westerners that I've met so intimately, and they started laughing. I was apologizing with my broken English, but I ended up laughing with them. And the 3 of us became kind of instant friends. You know why? Just because of ordinary human communication instincts. It was a funny situation. Nobody got hurt. And
yes.
After that, they came to see me throwing, and the park benches were so convenient that we sat around there and just talked.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Olga. After Olga was the first one to compete, and after she had won gold, she actually gives her good luck bear to Hal, who also wins gold. And after that, they started seeing one another around Melbourne. This causes great scandal among the Czechoslovak officials. But of course, Olga, as the only gold medal winner, was very, very difficult to discipline, if you like. And the great worry was that Olga would defect to the West because she was hanging out with these American warmongers. Now, Olga never intended to defect. She was always very much a loyal nationalist Czechoslovak, and always intended to go back home after the Olympic Games. But of course, the paranoid communist officials did not know that and were very, very worried. So what happens is eventually, after the Games, the Czechoslovak team is due to go back home on an Air France flight, charter flight, but the officials are worried that they're going to defect on the way. And so the whole team is taken to the Gruzia, which is the Russian ship that was in Port Melbourne. And they were literally given half an hour to pack and forced aboard and not allowed off. So I don't know what you might call it. To me, it sounds like the whole team was kidnapped. And there's actually a film in Czech that you can watch about a lot of the athletes who were aboard this ship. And it was a very, very unhappy time because it was all done at the last minute. Here you can see the athletes. These are the Czech athletes on the ship. And I assume Olga is among them somewhere on the right of your screen. The problem is because it was a last minute, one, they were given the worst accommodation in the bowels of the ship next to the engines. Two, the food was not particularly good. And because they hadn't taken on extra supplies and they had inadequate water. And you can see the athletes having to shower using seawater. The Czech athletes, this was a trip that eventually took about 20 days, whereas they would have been home in 5 days on the plane. And the athletes were very unhappy. A number of one athlete actually beat up a communist official. Another one got thrown into the swimming pool. There was open rebellion among the Czech athletes, but it became particularly serious when one of the shortages was toilet paper. And so they had a meeting on where to get extra supplies. At one point, they found a toilet in the first class section, which were, of course, occupied by the Russians, that had plentiful supplies, and they raided that. But that avenue stopped. And so all of a sudden, the Czech athletes discovered the ship library and went out and borrowed all the volumes of the collected works of Marx and Engels and Stalin and Trotsky and not Trotsky, sorry, and all the rest of it, Lenin. And funnily enough, after the ship landed, they never returned any of those books. So that's was the story of the trip. They went by ship, as I said, to Vladivostok, and then the Trans-Siberian Railway, initially to Moscow and back to Prague. Now, again, let's remember that Olga was the only gold medalist. And normally there would be a ceremony to welcome Olga as the Olympic gold medalist. And there was a ceremony of sorts. And perhaps if I can ask Olga this question, when you arrived home, Olga, have we got Olga on the screen?
Well, when I arrived home, people like on the street, streetcars, you know, the lady was selling newspapers. They were hugging me and they were so happy that I won the only medal. But the officials the Olympic officials, they really disappointed me greatly. And there was a lunch in my honor, let's say. I was given a golden wristwatch for my victory, but also accompanied by the words that I make them happy because of my medal, but made them embarrassed for my behavior about running around with an American fascist. Now, it made a big impression on me. I have to say that my trip from Australia, not only I met wonderful Australian people, and indeed in Siberia, I met a lot of people meeting the train, mainly wives of the men who were killed in World War II. And then coming to Czechoslovakia to that really hurt me. And I ended up, you know, like a defender of Hal Connolly, a teacher, a great athlete, and the whole America. Like the big USA suddenly became just a shining light, you know, for me, because it was such an unfair thing, because
Yes.
the USA helped Europe to clear from fascism.
Mm. Good. Thanks very much, Olga. So Olga's back in Prague. And by the way, Olga was training to be a doctor, if I'm right.
Yes.
Before you left, you were training to be a doctor.
Yes, actually, my only travel ambition was that when I get my MD degree, I can be allowed to leave for at least a year or two to work with Albert Schweitzer.
Well, that would be wonderful. Yeah.
So that was what I really wanted to do.
In Melbourne, Hal has actually proposed to Olga, and he says he'll come to Prague to arrange their wedding. And he does exactly that in February 1957.
Well, not that. He said he will come to Prague at some point, as soon as possible, or at some point, and wants to marry me. There was no formal agreement. And I'm honest, I thought I can never leave Prague. And all the people in Prague, the river, just everything. But I was, you know, there was so much hatred and bitterness that I got from Olympic officials that I decided they are changing the country forever. And that's it. And when Harold said, let's get married, I said, I wouldn't be allowed to. And Harold spoke, well, actually wrote a letter. We met the president. And at the end, the president said that he already heard from Mr. Dulles. Mr. Dulles saying that if I want to come there, I'll be blessed, already sending his blessing. And the president said, you go and represent us well.
You did get married, and I understand that you knew Emil and Dana Zadopek. Emil actually is at your wedding there.
Harold was actually staying with Emil and Dana. There is a big, beautiful city square in Prague. And as my car was approaching it, it stopped. And I thought there was an accident or something. But actually, it was a result of the city square was filled with somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people to come to our wedding. And one happy moment was that the wife of American ambassador
Mrs. Johnson.
like Harold's mother, representative, and we lost her and we couldn't find her. And she was dancing there to some music, some Czech people played lots of music and she was dancing and they were telling her how they love America.
Yeah, lovely story. Thank you, Olga. So, and part of the agreement when they got married is that it would be a quiet event. Now, 30,000 well-wishers is not a quiet event. And people came because, you know, obviously Olga was a celebrity. Hal was very exotic, being an American and a good-looking American. But there was also another element here, that there were few avenues to protest in Czechoslovakia at the time, and 30,000 people turning up in Wenceslas Square was in fact partly a protest of saying, you know, the sort of the romance, the liberty, all these things that Olga represented, and Hal, and reconciliation between East and West was something that the Czechoslovak people really wanted. So it was a very important event. It was joyous. As Olga has said, people were dancing in the streets. The churches were absolutely full of people. And I think a few of the angels, the angels' statues lost their wings of people crawling over them to get a good view. But it was it looked like a lovely wedding. But part of the agreement was also that straight after the ceremony, that Olga would have to leave Czechoslovakia and never compete for her country again, of which I understand you were very unhappy.
Oh, of course, that's a very, very difficult thing.
So obviously my book has a whole lot more stories there. There was secret operations, one called Operation Griffin, where the Americans tried to encourage the Hungarians to defect, and in fact, I think 45 did. And then there was a propaganda tour of America called the Freedom Tour. There were people trying to get East Germans to defect. The silver medalist, Stubik, was approached directly, and a stewardess of the Russian ship, the Gruzia, also disappeared, and there was a massive manhunt for her. So all those stories in my book, but that's really the end of it. I'm happy to take questions.
I don't want to damage this broadcast, but there is a story from Gruzia. I could shortly relate it because it's very Czech. Anyway, we were going through Hokkaido, near Hokkaido and Honshu, when an American airplane just flew over that ship, and the Czech officials started calling, hit the deck, they will shoot us. But instead, we jumped up and somebody was shouting, no, just jump out and show them how nice look Czech girls in bikinis. And so we are on that ship, just waving on these Americans. The plane made a one circle and then kept going. But I don't think the pilots ever forgotten that.
Lovely story. Thank you very much for that, Olga. Okay. Chris?
Thank you, Harry, so much for sharing these stories, and you've certainly whetted our appetite, I think, to look to your book for more of those. I know that we have many people in our audience who remember some of those events of '56, and so if you, Harry, and you, Olga, are willing, we'd love to take some questions from the audience. Anyone who would like to follow up on some of the fascinating topics that were raised here. Probably the easiest will be if you put your questions in the chat. There are so many of you. If you would like, you can, I guess, try and raise a hand and I may be able to pick you out. I'm just not sure if I'll be able to follow everyone this way.
Chris,
so a question coming in the chat.
Hand up, if you could.
Okay.
Tom Dommer.
I want to say first, Olga, you were beautiful in 1956 and still beautiful 66 years later. That's quite an inspiring and a wonderful, wonderful story. And thank you for that. Harry and I got together because I wrote my doctoral dissertation on this issue. And mine reads like a dissertation. Harry, yours reads like a suspense novel and a movie script. So I hope that somebody is going to get the rights to to make this as a movie, because it was exciting, and some of the characters that were there in the 50s are present in today as we speak, and it was wonderfully done.
Thanks very much, Tom.
Okay, I see a question that came in on the chat asking, did Olga eventually get her MD degree and see Dr. Schweitzer?
No. Unfortunately not. The situation became so tense in Prague that I just had to make a decision to stay and go. And I went. I hope to finish studying in Boston University, but unfortunately they wanted me to return almost to the beginning, because they just said that in communist country, medicine is not good enough to be given any credit. So that didn't work very well. That was it. That was just so, and the AAU, American Amateur Union, they said we couldn't accept any, we were offered beautiful gifts. We couldn't accept any because we would lose our amateur status. So it was a tough time, but we made it through, and made it through because whether it was in Czech Republic or whether it was in Boston or anywhere, they are always beautiful people there that they somehow hold you. And I may say, I'm talking too long, but my English became very good because Mr. Arthur Siegel, editors of Boston Globe newspaper, said, look, he's going to make a trade with me. I will clean up his office once a week, and he will pay me $100 because we did need money. And then I will stay there and study all the English readings, tests, everything, like 2 hours of studying English. And he did that like for a whole year, and it was part of my learning English. So there was people like that. It's all about the human interconnectedness. Amen.
Let's see, a number of questions and comments coming in through the chat. Let's see here.
Whatever you want to do, it's okay.
Yeah. Oh, from Linda Hillman, when was the last time, Olga, that you threw a discus?
When was the last time I threw the discus?
Yes.
Well, I competed in 1972 Olympic Games, and that's where I threw the discus there, but also I was so honored because it was the first time that captains of all teams of Olympic delegation were asked to vote for a flag bearer. And it makes me cry. I became the flag bearer. And so, oh God, I made that, and I decided that I have to stop crying, but it was a big, big thing. Well, anyway, so when I retired from competition, I studied a lot. And to become a fitness trainer and fitness specialist, and till this day, I am working wherever I can, like almost 12 years at the University of California at Irvine. I did so. I am just teaching people how to be healthy and how it prevents diseases, how it increases happiness. And you know, because what makes healthy nation is healthy people. And that's all I'm doing here in my little way, whatever they are. Okay, that's now you know everything.
Thank you.
You know, then I wrote one book that was in 1968 in English, but it was too long and it was kind of shortened. It was called The Rings of Destiny. Then I was asked by Czech television back in 2007 or something. I wrote the similar book in Czech language, not just a translation, but more updated. And that was published in Prague. I don't know how it is doing, if it's there in library. And, but since then, I have just been writing for anybody in the world who wants to read it about how to appreciate human bodies as the miracle of nature's engineering and our individual responsibilities to keep it in best shape.
Okay. A comment came in on chat, just sort of to fill this out. This is someone who said, oh, where did I lose that comment? Yeah, athletes who competed in the 1960 games in Rome. And I'm guessing this is Czechoslovak athletes, but it's not specified here. Yeah, and this friend said that they were so strictly separated and watched that they had no chance to meet with any of the other foreign athletes. So does that sound right, Harry, from what you've researched, that it then became more difficult in the 60s for Eastern Bloc athletes to interact with athletes from the West?
What would happen would be those athletes who were good party members and reliable were used as, you know, posters for the Soviet Union. So again, perhaps I've got to go back to 56. Vladimir Kutz, the long distance runner, was everywhere in the media because he was a good communist, whereas other athletes who were a bit more suspect were being followed. And in some cases, particularly from Latvia, because those countries were still very much suspect. One, I think it was a decathlon athlete, was actually kept on the ship, even though he was the world champion and was guaranteed a gold medal. They wouldn't let him compete at the last minute because they feared he was going to defect. So, yes, a lot of them were kept under very close scrutiny, but some of them who were considered reliable were out there because they wanted to show how friendly they were. You know, we're peace-loving, the capitalist America warmongers. So there was propaganda there as well.
Of course.
If you want me to add something that's extremely significant for me too. When I was leaving Czechoslovakia, I promised the president, then Zapotocki, whatever president, that I will compete for Czechoslovakia. I'll live in America, but I'll compete for Czechoslovakia. And at the beginning of 1960, I wrote a letter to the Czechoslovakian Olympic Committee asking, do I need to come to compete there and qualify, or would qualifications in the United States be sufficient? And I received a letter back that says they no longer consider me as Czech, as being a part of, Zakrajanku. And therefore, I am not qualified anymore in any way to represent Czechoslovakia. And that broke my heart. But then what was even worse, when I came to Rome, I saw a number of Czechs. I ran to them and they turned around and started walking the other direction. One detached herself, whatever. One detached from the group, came to me, spat in front of me, and ran away. I was crying. I mean, I kept saying, I'm a displaced person, I'm a displaced person. Only in 1968 Olympic Games, I ran into a number of cyclists from Czechoslovakia. And one said, "Are you Olga?" I said, "Yes." And they said, "Yes, we heard about you." I can't say it exactly in English, but they said, vy jste jistě chtěla závodit, ale ty naši bolové vám to nedovolili, že jo? And I said, that's what happened. And eventually, I think in the book in Czech language, I think there is I have the text of the letter from that said I could no longer compete for Czechoslovakia. But that was hard. Believe me, that was a hard moment. But then again, I am extremely blessed. I carried Czechoslovakian flag when I played basketball at European Championship, University Championships, and I carried American flag. So in 72. So who can ask for more? I mean, who can ask for more? No one.
Thank you. A lot of fan mail coming in the chat as well, Olga. A lot of people inspired by your story and thanking you for sharing, and people plan to go out and read your book to learn more. One additional question came in. Why was Olga allowed to leave?
For some reason. I don't have the reason. The newspaperman, the leading probably was Parimatch, because one of their writers actually came to Prague and stayed with us, even visited my parents who worked in Spolana factory. I mean, he was like very much, and other newspapers for some reason started to write that why can't I go and marry an American? It kind of was like almost, it was like happening like beside me. It just was, I didn't know any of those people. And Harold was in Prague only a few days. We did go to see the president, but it was just, I think Emil Zatopek was helping very much, because Emil Zatopek was such an international figure, much greater than we give him credit, right? And also he was used that way. Emil ended up by having run so much in every marathon the Czechs could send him, he would do that until he destroyed the fascial tissues in his groins. irreparable way. It couldn't be repaired. And the reason I know it, because he came here on his way to Stanford. The doctors at Stanford tried to help him also, but it was impossible. And of course, after everything he has done for Czechoslovakia, he spoke out and was relegated to be sweeping streets in Prague. I tell you, if I would have been in Prague, you know, I'd be sweeping streets with Emil Záchata. There will be never, I don't see there ever will be more deserving athlete in any country than was Emil.
Yeah. Can I perhaps just come in from a different point of view there? What happened was that when Hal went to Prague and they were having difficulty getting permission to get married, Foster Dulles, who Olga did refer to, the Secretary of State, started to use that as propaganda. And there were headlines in newspapers around the world, you know, communists are against love, the West is for love. And so it became a propaganda platform. And eventually it just became too much for the Czechs. And so it was just easier to let them get married because it had become an international issue, not just in America, but in Germany and throughout Europe. That was the compromise that, yes, she could get married, but had to leave the country.
Well, yes, I think it sounds almost like too much for me to say, but during the Olympic Games in London, I heard from the Financial Times or some reporter, whatever, that the Financial Times felt that our wedding, Harold's and my wedding, was very welcome because it put a crack into the Iron Curtain.
Yeah, I totally agree.
A little bit of crack in the Iron Curtain. So, I don't know. It's a long time ago. It's just, all I can tell you, everybody, walk. Walking is the most important exercise anybody can do. It works for the whole body. So that's my advice as a fitness specialist.
Well, I think looking at Olga, we can all take that as advice worth following.
Olga, I have one quick question, which maybe makes no sense, but just to liaise to our event in April. Were you ever member of Sokol?
Oh, yes, of course. Well, you see now, Harry gave me 1 minute here and 1 minute there. Of course, I was brought up in Sokol.
Yeah.
When my mother was, every week we lived in a place called Libish, and there was a small gym, and my mother exercised there, my aunt exercised there, or aunts. Of course, I was a member of Sokol.
So
I was not a member as, as diligent, like as others, because I was involved in athletics. And athletics was maybe later, but athletics and Sokol gymnastics were kind of a separate, except like by gymnasts, maybe Vera Časlavská. I don't know if she started, but but throwing the discus, playing basketball, being a goalie for the national team in team handball or Hazena, the Hazena, that was not part of Sokol. In gymnasium, you had real good physical education, excellent physical education. And then you learn fundamentals of sports. And if you really like those sports, then you went to sports club separate. Like I played team handball for Slavia, and I played basketball for Sparta. Although they were conflicted in football, it was okay. I had t-shirts. I still do, I guess. I still do. I have learned, I have learned from sports to be kind of a peacemaker. That, it's just, that's what it is, to be kind of getting along with everybody on some of the physical, mental, spiritual basis, like the old Greeks did it. And the teachers in Czechoslovakia, they still lived by the Kaloskaj agathos in the triangle, physical, mental, and spiritual. I wish all that would come back today.
Peace is a good thought to end our program with today, the wish for peace. And thanks so much to our presenters for sharing these amazing episodes from our not too distant history. And again, looking forward to hopefully seeing many of you who joined us today. Please come and join us again on April 10th for a related program.
Oh, thank you very much. I actually enjoyed all the conversation and the program very much. That's how programs should be. We need some peace in this world. People have to start talking to each other. Not like having one Slavic nation attacking another Slavic nation. That's obsolete. That's gotta go. Okay, don't make me talk, because then
Okay.
Czech women talk a lot. So when you switch me from American to Czech, then I can't stop talking. Já mou duši. Teď já můžu mluvit česky taky, že jo? My nemůžeme začít teď mluvit česky.
Buy the book. Buy Harry's book. Yeah, buy and read it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you all next time.
Okay, bye now. Just have a wonderful day, week, month, year. I really enjoyed this afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Moc děkujeme. Moc děkujeme.
Okay.